The ladder groaned beneath my weight as I descended, each rung an echoing clang that seemed to bounce off the walls of that black, yawning elevator shaft into infinity, and the stale, recycled air pressed in on me from all sides, thick with the metallic tang of rust and forgotten machinery, so heavy I could almost taste it, sharp, bitter, and unforgiving. While somewhere above, the faint scrape of the door behind me creaked open with a drawn-out sigh that stretched into a low, wet chuckle, a sound not quite human and not quite machinery, but the unmistakable promise of something waiting, patient and unrelenting, threading itself through the shadows like a spider weaving its web, binding me inch by inch in anticipation of a struggle it knew I could not escape. I swallowed, the bitter aftertaste settling in my mouth, and forced my fingers to grip the ladder tightly despite the trembling that seized my arms as if the very weight of my body betrayed me, climbing down rung after rung into the abyss below, the darkness swallowing every sliver of light, every hint of air, until even my own breath seemed alien and the sound of it like a hammer pounding against the cold, dead silence, breaking it just enough to remind me that I was utterly alone. Or so I hoped. The cold bit through the thin fabric of my bare suit, the dampness seeping in from the walls slick with condensation and decades of neglect, and the further I descended, the more I became aware of the silence turning into a heavy, oppressive presence that wasn't empty but full. Full of waiting eyes and whispers pressed so close they might have been breathed onto the back of my neck, a congregation of forgotten souls folded into the concrete like fossils waiting to be discovered, and as my boots finally touched the ground with a hollow thud that seemed to bounce endlessly, the ladder behind me groaned again, and I dared not look up lest the thing that had followed might be closer than I thought. I took a step forward, the beam from the small flashlight clipped to my belt cutting a narrow path through the black, revealing nothing but cracked pipes and puddles reflecting the ghostly shimmer of distant, unreliable light, but the air was alive with the scent of mildew and decay, layered with something metallic, a smell that made my stomach churn and my skin crawl like the whispered breath of corpses brushing against me from just beyond the edge of vision. The elevator shaft was a tomb, a mausoleum for machinery and memories alike, and somewhere deeper, a low, steady hum began to pulse, not mechanical, but alive, a heartbeat that reverberated through the floor beneath my boots and into the marrow of my bones, and the walls seemed to close in imperceptibly, a narrowing corridor of shadow and dread that urged me onward and downward with the inexorable promise that this was not the way out but the way in. I stumbled into a cavernous chamber filled with twisted metal scaffolding and broken control panels whose blinking lights flickered like dying stars, and there, half hidden in the gloom, was a desk, ancient, scarred with cigarette burns and dark stains that refused to name themselves, and behind it, slouched in an oversized leather chair cracked and peeling like dead skin, sat the director. He didn't stand. He didn't move. He only watched. His eyes were sunken wells of shadow beneath a shock of graying hair, and his thin lips curled into a smile so slow it was almost a grimace, a smile that stretched across a face carved with lines deeper than the cracks in the floor and eyes that glimmered with a cold, unyielding purpose that chilled the marrow of my spine. He spoke without moving his lips. His voice was a rasp that slid into my mind like poison, layering over my thoughts until I could no longer distinguish my own memories from his commands. Welcome back. We've been waiting. The show must go on. Around him, the air shimmered with the presence of others. Shadowed figures caught in frozen poses like statues, costumes hanging limp and faces blurred into masks of despair, all part of his eternal audience, and I realized then that this was the true stage, the hidden engine room where the play was directed not by scripts but by control and fear and the unyielding grip of a man who had refused to leave, whose power thrived on the surrender of those who came before me and those who would come after. I wanted to run. But the suit was a second skin now. And the director's gaze was a chain tightening around my throat. He gestured with a skeletal hand to a dusty script laid open on the desk, words scrawled in ink that seemed to writhe and twist like living things, spelling out scenes I had never auditioned for and roles I could not refuse. "Your part is crucial," he whispered, voice curling around me like smoke, "for without you, the story dies, and with it, everything we built." Behind him, the frozen audience began to stir. Limbs twitching, heads tilting with unnatural jerks, their hollow eyes fixing on me, waiting. And somewhere deep in the pit of my stomach, a cold, sharp understanding bloomed. Escape was not just difficult. It was impossible. Because here, in this forgotten heart of the park, the show had been running long before me and would continue long after I was gone. And the only way to survive was to perform. The cold leather chair beneath the director creaked faintly as he shifted his weight, the sound barely audible above the heavy silence that had fallen like a shroud over the chamber, thick and suffocating, pressing against my lungs and squeezing the air from my lungs like invisible hands intent on smothering every spark of hope, and I could feel his eyes boring into me. Those hollow, sunken orbs flickering with a sinister intelligence, a predator's patience that had long since outlived any shred of mercy, while the shadows around us stretched and writhed, crawling along the cracked concrete walls as if the darkness itself had come alive, eager to swallow me whole and dissolve me into nothing but another forgotten fragment of this endless theater of torment. He extended a skeletal finger, thin and trembling yet commanding, toward the open script that lay on the desk between us, its pages yellowed with age and etched with ink that seemed to shimmer faintly, as though the words themselves were breathing, alive with whispered threats and promises that slithered beneath my skin, a language I could neither forget nor fully comprehend, and his voice, dry and rasping, filled the room with an eerie cadence, each syllable falling like a hammer blow that echoed in my bones. You see, the story isn't merely lines to be memorized or scenes to be enacted, it is the very fabric of this place, stitched into every splinter of wood, every rusted bolt of the rides, and every grain of dust that clings to the shattered windows. You do not simply play your part, you become it, and in becoming it, you bind yourself to the stage for eternity. The words wrapped around me, thick and suffocating, blurring the edges of reality until I wasn't sure if the room was shrinking or if I was expanding, melting into the grotesque tapestry of the park's dark history, a history soaked in desperation and broken dreams, sewn together by the hands of a man who had long ago surrendered his soul to the hunger of control, and as I looked down, I noticed my hands trembling within the bare suit's paws, the fabric slick with cold sweat that seeped like ice into my bones, while the mask I wore felt heavier than ever, as if it were grafted not just to my skin, but to my very identity, threatening to consume what little humanity remained. Behind the director, the frozen audience had begun to move again. Slow, deliberate, and agonizingly unnatural, their faces obscured by masks cracked and peeling, yet beneath those masks, I sensed something still breathing, something that longed to reach out with brittle, trembling fingers and drag me into their eternal performance, a macabre chorus line trapped in a cycle of decay and despair, their whispered laughter swirling through the air like a poisonous mist, tickling my ears with fragments of forgotten songs and half-remembered lines that gnawed at my sanity. I swallowed hard, feeling the stale air catch in my throat as the director's voice dipped lower, more intimate, yet no less menacing, a velvet trap woven from the threads of dread. There is no curtain call, no final bow. Each act leads only to the next, and the audience grows restless without a willing star. The question is, will you rise to the occasion, or will you become just another ghost trapped behind the scenes? The room seemed to pulse with the weight of those words, the shadows deepening as the faint hum that had haunted the elevator shaft swelled into a discordant symphony of creaks, groans, and distant, indistinguishable whispers, and I felt the cold grasp of panic clutch at my heart, tightening with each breath as the boundary between the living and the performance blurred, and I realized that the true horror wasn't the grotesque figures or the decaying park, but the director himself, whose obsession with the show had twisted him into something more dangerous than any ghost or monster. A sudden movement caught my eye. A flicker of motion from the corner of the room where a rusted mirror hung cracked and splintered, reflecting not my own face, but a dozen shifting masks, each contorted into expressions of terror, joy, madness, and despair, their eyes seeming to follow me with hungry intent, and I stumbled back, heart pounding so fiercely it threatened to burst free of my chest, the sound a deafening drum in the oppressive silence. The director's smile deepened, cruel and knowing. Time is a script you cannot rewrite, but the choices you make within it determine whether you play the part, or become the tragedy. The chair creaked again as he rose slowly, the sound of leather scraping against concrete echoing like a death knell, and as he stepped closer, I caught the faintest glint of a knife in his hand. Old, worn, and stained with a rust that spoke of long years spent in the shadows, and the cold smile that twisted his face as he advanced was a promise of the nightmare yet to unfold. There was no escaping the stage. No escaping the director's shadow. Only the terrifying certainty that the show must go on. The moment the director took that slow, deliberate step toward me, the air shifted. Thickened into something almost tactile, like a viscous fog curling around my limbs and dragging me down into a pool of cold despair from which I couldn't escape, and despite every instinct screaming at me to run, my feet felt glued to the cracked concrete floor, heavy as though anchored by the weight of decades of decay and forgotten screams that lingered in this place like a rancid perfume, seeping into the very fibers of my being, while the shadows around us seemed to stretch and recoil. Alive with a malignant hunger, crawling in restless waves across the walls and ceiling, their tendrils brushing the edges of my mind, promising oblivion if I dared to look away. His eyes gleamed. Dark pits reflecting the flickering light of a broken bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling, casting grotesque shadows that danced with every twitch of his cracked, yellowed smile, a smile that was no longer human but something monstrous, twisted by obsession and madness until it was a mask of pure malevolence, and his breath reeked of stale tobacco and rot, a sickening blend that filled the space between us and crawled inside my lungs, each inhalation a needle of nausea that bloomed like acid in my gut, and I realized with a sudden, freezing clarity that this was no longer a game, no longer a performance or a twisted role I could slip out of. This was a trap, and I was the prey. "Don't fight it," he whispered, voice slick and low like oil spilled over cracked pavement, a sound meant to lull, to unnerve, to bind. Resistance only drags out the inevitable. The stage is set, and the audience waits. Your part is written in blood now. His hand tightened around the rusted knife until the knuckles whitened, the faint scrape of metal against metal a sinister whisper in the cavernous room, and my breath hitched, muscles coiling like springs ready to snap, heart pounding a frantic rhythm that throbbed through my ears and blurred my vision with a wet sheen of panic, but the bare suit, my second skin, felt suddenly suffocating, the fabric chafing against sweat-slicked skin as if it were alive and hungry, a living shackle reminding me that whatever freedom I thought I had was an illusion. Behind him, the frozen audience began to stir once more, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets dragged on strings pulled by an unseen puppeteer, the grotesque tableau of torn costumes and cracked masks coming to life in a macabre dance that sent cold dread crawling up my spine, their hollow, glassy eyes gleaming with anticipation, as if they too thirsted for the performance, for the suffering, for the inevitable fall. I tried to back away, but the walls closed in with every step, the narrow chamber shrinking like a coffin, and the flickering light overhead sputtered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach for me with fingers made of darkness, pressing against my skin and whispering promises of pain and endless night, and I felt my legs buckle, the cold seeping through the soles of my boots as I crumpled against the rough concrete, the rough texture biting into my palms as I scrambled for purchase, desperate to put distance between myself and the director's advancing shadow. "You can't hide behind that mask forever," he hissed, stepping closer until his breath was a rancid cloud that clung to my face. "The truth always comes out. Here, in this place, you'll find what you're truly made of." And then, as if summoned by the sheer weight of his presence, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into stuttering darkness punctuated by harsh, jagged bursts of light that threw the chamber into grotesque relief. The rusted machinery gleaming like skeletal bones, the broken mirrors reflecting fragmented, twisted versions of myself, the frozen audience suddenly caught mid-scream, their faces locked in eternal torment, and in that chaotic dance of light and shadow, I glimpsed something behind the director. A figure, tall and still, shrouded in darkness so dense it seemed to swallow the feeble glow, its face hidden, but its presence unmistakable, a specter waiting patiently, its silent promise colder than death itself. Panic surged like wildfire, scorching rational thought as the knife gleamed again, the director's grin widening into something feral and triumphant, and I realized there was no way out, no salvation. Only the crushing certainty that this nightmare had only just begun, and the real performance was yet to start. The figure lurking just beyond the director's silhouette was an abyssal presence, a void in the already oppressive darkness of the chamber, its form dissolving into the shadows like smoke caught in a slow, endless swirl, and despite the wavering light from the flickering bulb above, no detail emerged. Only the suggestion of an unnatural height, the faintest outline of shoulders hunched with a terrible, patient weight, and the absence of a face so absolute it seemed to swallow all light, all hope, all reason, leaving me paralyzed with the raw, bone-deep terror of the unknown, the nameless thing that watched without blinking, without breathing, a silent sentinel whose presence warped the very air around it, thickening it into a suffocating shroud that choked out the remnants of my courage. The director's voice faltered for a moment, a rare crack in his otherwise unwavering menace, as if he too felt the cold pressure radiating from the figure behind him, but he recovered swiftly, the cruel smile reasserting itself like a blade sliding free from its sheath, and his gaze locked onto mine with an intensity that scorched through the bare suit's fabric and drilled into the marrow of my bones, leaving me exposed and trembling beneath his watchful, predatory scrutiny, as if I were nothing more than a fragile puppet dangling by strings in his grasp, waiting to be broken and discarded. "Do you see it?" he hissed, voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo endlessly through the hollow chamber. "The one who judges your every move, who waits to see if you crumble or rise. This is the true director of our show, the silent spectator, unseen by the crowds, but all-seeing, all-knowing, and merciless beyond comprehension." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat, the bitter tang of fear suffusing every nerve ending like a poison that spread relentlessly through my body, and my hands clenched into fists, the fabric of the bare suit stretching taut over trembling fingers. But no matter how desperately I tried to summon the strength to stand, my legs betrayed me, sinking me to the floor in a shuddering heap as the figure's presence closed around me like a suffocating fog, cold and unyielding. The director stepped aside, gesturing grandly to the silent spectator, who remained motionless, a shadow among shadows, its silence louder than a scream, and the room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, thick with the weight of unspoken horrors and countless forgotten victims whose whispers lingered like ghosts trapped between moments of time, their voices threading together into a dreadful chorus that filled the space with aching despair and relentless dread. "You are not alone," the director said softly, almost kindly, though the menace beneath his words was unmistakable. "Every performer has an audience, and every audience has a judge. Fail, and the consequences are eternal." The walls seemed to close in further, the flickering light dimming to a sickly orange glow that cast grotesque shadows across the shattered mirrors and twisted metal scaffolding, while the air grew colder still, as if the very breath of the silent spectator was freezing the marrow in my bones, leaving me gasping for warmth and light that would never come, trapped in a nightmare woven from the threads of madness and despair. And in that moment, as the director's knife gleamed once more, catching the fragile light and reflecting it in cruel, jagged shards, I understood that the true horror was not just the physical threat before me, but the crushing weight of an eternal performance watched over by a judge who never blinked, never smiled, and whose silence was more terrifying than any scream. The chamber's stale, oppressive air seemed to thicken with every breath I drew, as though invisible hands were coiling tighter around my chest, squeezing with a slow, inexorable force that stole my ability to inhale deeply, filling my lungs with a choking mix of dust, rust, and the acrid stench of rot, a miasma born from years of neglect and despair, crawling through the cracks in the walls and pooling in the corners where the light dared not touch. The flickering bulb above sputtered and buzzed, casting sickly shadows that twisted and writhed across the cracked concrete like malignant serpents eager to ensnare me in their silent coil, while the grotesque frozen audience behind the director shifted with unnatural jerks, their cracked, peeling masks catching the faint glow and reflecting fragmented versions of my own terror back at me in shattered, mocking images. My heart thundered in my ears, a deafening drumbeat echoing through the cavernous room, drowning out reason and logic as panic clawed at the edges of my mind with talons sharp and merciless, and yet, despite the primal urge to flee, to tear off the bare suit and sprint into the dark unknown, my body remained rooted to the spot, a marionette bound by invisible threads of dread spun by the director and his silent, faceless ally lurking beyond the veil of flickering light. The director's voice sliced through the stifling silence, low and venomous, dripping with calculated menace that slithered into my ears and nestled like a viper in my thoughts. "Every step you take tightens the noose around your neck. Every breath you steal inches you closer to the inevitable end, the final act that binds your soul to this endless stage. His gaze locked onto mine with a predator's intensity, the knife in his hand gleaming like a shard of nightmare forged in the abyss, and the cold, metallic scent of blood seemed to seep from the very walls themselves, flooding the room with a chilling reminder of the countless lives that had been extinguished within these cursed halls. As he advanced, the shadows stretched and contorted, crawling up the walls like ink spilled in slow motion, while the frozen audience's eyes, dull and lifeless moments ago, now flickered with eerie, unnatural light, their hollow gazes piercing through the thick darkness to fixate on me with unblinking hunger, as if I were the centerpiece of a grotesque ceremony unfolding in some otherworldly theater where hope was the ultimate sacrilege. A sudden metallic clang echoed sharply from somewhere deep within the shadows, sending a jolt of cold electricity down my spine and snapping my attention to the rusted machinery lining the walls, the skeletal remains of rides long dead and forgotten, their twisted frames reaching out like skeletal hands desperate to drag me into the abyss of their ruin. The sound reverberated again, closer this time, and a low, guttural whisper rippled through the stale air. A voice not quite human, fractured and broken, yet unmistakably alive, promising torment and eternal imprisonment beneath the crumbling facade of laughter and joy. My breath hitched as the bare suit's fabric clung to my sweat-slicked skin, suffocating and heavy like a shroud woven from nightmare itself, and the weight of the mask pressed relentlessly against my face, blurring the line between flesh and costume until I feared I would lose myself completely, swallowed by the monstrous persona forced upon me by the merciless director whose shadow fell long and cold across every inch of this hellish stage. Time fractured and splintered. Seconds stretching into agonizing eternities as the walls seemed to pulse with the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the park itself, a living, breathing entity fueled by anguish and decay, its lifeblood the screams and despair of those trapped in its unforgiving grasp, and I felt the crushing certainty that escape was a lie, that I was merely a player in a twisted drama scripted by madness and enforced with ruthless cruelty. The director stopped just inches from me, the knife's tip tracing a slow, deliberate line across the cracked floor, and his voice dropped to a chilling whisper, barely audible but cutting deeper than any blade. "You're mine now. Bound to this place. To the role. To the endless performance. The curtain will never fall." And in that instant, as the shadows swallowed his form and the silent spectator's gaze bore into my soul from the darkness beyond, I understood the terrible truth. That this was not just a place of ruin and death, but a living nightmare where the lines between reality and performance had been irrevocably erased, and I was trapped at the center, a puppet with no strings left to pull, dancing toward a finale written in blood and despair. Even as the director's shadow receded into the flickering gloom, the oppressive silence he left behind pressed against me with the weight of a tombstone, heavy and unyielding, a suffocating blanket that swallowed the remnants of my shattered resolve and left me trembling in the darkness like a marionette whose strings had been cruelly severed. Abandoned, helpless, and utterly exposed to the relentless scrutiny of the silent spectator, whose unseen gaze carved icy paths down my spine and echoed through the cavernous void with the soundless roar of 1,000 forgotten screams trapped in the recesses of this forsaken park. The air itself seemed to pulse with a slow, agonizing heartbeat, a rhythm that resonated deep within my chest, syncing with the frantic pounding of my own blood as it surged through veins suddenly electric with fear and desperation, each beat a thunderclap in the silence, each pulse a reminder that I was still tethered to this nightmare by fragile threads of flesh and bone. Threads that threatened to snap with every breath, every shuddering gasp that echoed against the rusted skeletons of broken rides and shattered dreams. A distant sound rippled through the darkness, faint and wavering at first. The creak of ancient metal bending under the weight of time, the soft whisper of loose debris skittering across cracked concrete, and then, unmistakably, the slow, deliberate footsteps of something moving just beyond the reach of the dim, flickering light, a presence that stalked the edges of my vision like a predator circling its prey, silent and relentless, promising agony with every inch it closed. I forced myself to stand, knees weak and trembling, the bare suit clinging to me like a second skin soaked with sweat and terror, and as I turned slowly, every sense heightened to a razor's edge, the shadows around me writhed and shifted, revealing fragmented glimpses of the grotesque audience. Frozen figures caught mid-gesture, their cracked masks twisted into eternal expressions of horror and despair, their eyes dull but somehow accusing, as if the weight of countless untold stories bore down upon me, demanding penance for sins I had yet to comprehend. The oppressive darkness closed in further, swallowing the flickering light in long, ravenous gulps, until I was plunged into a void where sound and sight twisted into something unrecognizable and hostile, and the silence was shattered by a sudden, sharp scrape, the unmistakable sound of metal clawing against metal, echoing with a cruel insistence that set my teeth on edge and sent a shiver writhing down my spine like a living thing. From the shadows emerged a figure. Not the director, but something else, something raw and desperate, hunched and ragged, its breath ragged and uneven, eyes wild and gleaming with a mixture of madness and fear, a reflection of the same hopelessness that clawed at my own heart, and for a moment, our gazes locked in a silent, frantic understanding, two lost souls caught in the same twisted performance, struggling against the invisible chains that bound us both to this theater of horrors. But there was no time for solace, no room for empathy in the suffocating darkness. The figure lurched forward, a broken shard of humanity driven by desperation and pain, and I realized with a jolt that the true antagonist of this nightmare was not some spectral force or eldritch horror, but something far more grounded and terrifying, a fractured mind, shattered by years of isolation and torment within these walls, twisted into a living weapon forged by madness and despair. My breath caught in my throat as the figure closed the distance, the stale, fetid air carrying the scent of sweat and decay, and I knew that to survive, I would have to confront not only the darkness lurking in the shadows but the darkness festering within myself, a battle far more harrowing than any physical struggle, where the line between hunter and hunted blurred into oblivion beneath the ever-watchful eyes of the silent spectator. The figure's wild eyes bore into mine like twin shards of shattered glass, reflecting a madness that gnawed away at the edges of my sanity with the relentless persistence of a disease long untreated, and as the stale air thickened between us, heavy with the fetid stench of decay and unspoken violence, I realized that this broken soul was the mirror I dreaded most. The fractured reflection of what I could become if I let the nightmare consume me utterly, if I allowed the suffocating silence of this forgotten amusement park to drown out the last flicker of hope buried deep within my chest. Every step the figure took echoed like a death knell in the hollow chamber, the scraping of ragged clothing against rusted metal and cracked concrete sounding as if the very walls were groaning under the weight of inevitable despair, while the flickering bulb above threatened to give out completely, plunging us both into a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow all meaning, all light, leaving nothing but the oppressive black void where nightmares coiled and waited to strike. I could see the torment etched into every line of the figure's gaunt face, the haunted shadows beneath sunken eyes, the trembling lips barely containing a scream long held hostage by silence, and the trembling hands curled into desperate claws that reached toward me, not with the promise of harm but with the raw, aching plea of a soul grasping for connection in a world abandoned by mercy and reason. The bare suit felt like a tomb, its fabric pressing uncomfortably against my sweat-slicked skin, a suffocating barrier between who I was and who I feared I might become, and every breath I drew was shallow and ragged, a desperate attempt to hold on to the fragile thread of sanity that threatened to unravel with each agonizing moment spent in this chamber of horrors. And yet, even as terror gnawed at my insides, a flicker of something else, something fragile and defiant, ignited within me, a stubborn ember of resistance against the suffocating darkness, a silent vow to survive this living nightmare no matter the cost, to fight back against the monstrous reflection in front of me and reclaim the shattered fragments of my own soul before they too dissolved into the abyss. The figure's trembling form faltered, caught between madness and fleeting clarity, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, raw and broken, it uttered words that echoed like a mournful dirge through the chamber. We're both prisoners, bound by this cursed place, trapped in the same endless performance. Those words hung in the air like a curse, heavy and irrevocable, and as the flickering light finally died, plunging us into utter darkness, I knew with a dreadful certainty that the nightmare was far from over, that the true terror was not the haunted rides or the broken masks, but the fragile humanity twisted and shattered by years of torment, waiting silently for the moment to consume me whole. The darkness around me was absolute, a dense, suffocating void that pressed against my skin like a living thing, cold and clammy as if the very shadows had taken form to reach inside my chest and crush the fragile beat of my heart beneath their relentless grip, and I stood frozen, ears straining for the faintest hint of sound, for any sign that I was not utterly alone in this tomb of forgotten horrors. But all I heard was the maddening silence. Thick, viscous, and heavy with the weight of forgotten screams that seemed to coil endlessly around the rusted skeletons of rides long dead, their hollow frames whispering secrets no living soul should ever hear. The fractured figure from before was gone, vanished into the blackness like a fading nightmare, but their presence lingered in the stale air, a lingering echo of broken humanity that crawled beneath my skin and settled in the hollow spaces of my mind, gnawing relentlessly at the edges of my sanity with sharp teeth of despair and a cold, remorseless hunger that whispered of finality, the end of hope, the extinguishing of all light. I forced myself to move, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the crushing weight of the void, the bare suit's fabric slick with sweat and dust clinging to my skin as I edged forward, guided only by the faintest glimmers of light flickering somewhere deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the park, where the ghosts of laughter and joy had long since been drowned in a sea of decay and rot. The walls around me pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic throb, a slow, deliberate heartbeat that resonated deep within my chest and threatened to overwhelm my senses with its primal, unyielding insistence, as if the park itself was alive, a monstrous organism feeding on despair and torment, its veins and arteries the twisted pathways of rusted steel and crumbling concrete, and its breath the rancid stench of forgotten souls trapped in an eternal dance of suffering and madness. I pressed my back against the cold, rough surface of a wall and closed my eyes, willing my racing heart to slow, to find some semblance of calm in the storm raging within, but the darkness behind my eyelids was no refuge. It twisted into nightmarish visions of faces frozen in silent screams, of hands reaching out from the shadows to drag me down into the abyss, and the echoing sound of footsteps that were not my own, relentless and inevitable, closing in with every agonizing second. A sudden metallic clang shattered the silence, a sharp, piercing note that reverberated through the chamber like a gunshot, and I spun around, muscles coiled tight like a spring ready to snap, searching desperately for the source. But there was nothing there except the sickly glow of a single, flickering bulb hanging precariously from a frayed wire, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced on the walls like specters summoned from the depths of hell. The footsteps began again, slower this time, deliberate and measured, echoing off the cracked concrete with a rhythmic certainty that set my teeth on edge and ignited a primal fear so raw and consuming that it threatened to unravel the fragile thread of my reason, leaving me a trembling, broken thing caught in the jaws of a living nightmare. And then, from the far end of the corridor, a voice. Low, gravelly, dripping with cruel amusement and something far darker, something ancient and unforgiving, whispered my name, carrying on the stale air like a death sentence delivered in a lover's caress, and I knew, with a certainty that burned through every fiber of my being, that the true horror was not the park itself, but the hunter who had been stalking me from the shadows, waiting patiently for the final act. The voice lingered in the heavy air like a poison, curling around my spine with icy tendrils that left a trail of frozen dread in their wake, and though the darkness swallowed its source, the sound was unmistakably close, a sinister murmur that seemed to slither out from the very shadows themselves, winding through the dilapidated corridors with cruel intent. Every syllable was etched with menace, low and grinding, a guttural echo of the twisted mind that haunted this forsaken place. This hunter who had been stalking me through the rusted carcass of the park, whose footsteps I'd long since ceased to question but never stopped fearing. My breath caught, shallow and ragged, as I pressed myself against the cold wall, its rough surface a bitter comfort against the slick sweat threatening to betray my terror. The bare suit hung heavy on my frame, soaked through with the damp chill of the place, and the mask felt like a leaden weight suffocating my very thoughts, blurring the line between myself and the monstrous role I'd been forced to play. I dared not move. Any motion might draw the hunter closer, tighten the invisible noose strangling what little hope remained in my chest. The corridor stretched out before me, a broken tunnel of peeling paint, fractured tiles, and splintered wood that groaned under the weight of years without care, the faintest glimmer of dying fluorescent lights flickering intermittently like the last gasps of a drowning man. Shadows pooled in every crevice, dripping like tar, alive with the promise of unseen horrors lurking just beyond the fragile boundary of sight and sanity. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the tremor in my hands, and as the silence thickened, so thick it seemed to press into my ears, muffling my own heartbeat, I felt it, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way the temperature plummeted in a sudden, cruel wave, the way the darkness seemed to lean in, closer and closer, as if eager to swallow me whole. Then, just as I began to inch forward, a sharp click rang out, a metallic sound like the winding of an ancient clock. And my heart slammed against my ribs as I instinctively froze, every muscle taut, every nerve screaming. From the shadows emerged a figure, grotesque and human all at once, the lines of his face carved by years of malice and neglect, eyes glittering with cold calculation and a sadistic hunger that made my skin crawl. He was no ghost, no specter conjured by madness. He was flesh and bone, a man who had worn this park's decay like a second skin, a hunter who understood these corridors intimately and wielded their darkness like a weapon. His grin was slow and cruel, a curling slash of malice that revealed teeth stained and chipped, and his gaze locked onto mine with a predatory focus that stripped away all pretense of safety. "You can't run from this, you know," he whispered, voice low and rough, each word dragging across the silence like a blade. "This place, it owns you now. Every step you take just leads you deeper into my trap." The words wrapped around me, suffocating and absolute, and I knew with brutal clarity that I was utterly, irrevocably caught in his web. A spider trapped in a decaying web of rust and rot, each thread tightened by his cruel hands, each moment drawing me closer to a fate I dared not imagine but could no longer escape. As he advanced, the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe, alive with a malevolent energy that seeped into my bones, and I realized, with a surge of desperate clarity, that this was not just a man hunting me, but the very embodiment of the park's cruelty, the living pulse of its heart of darkness. I backed away, the cold sweat slicking my palms as the final, flickering light above shattered into darkness, plunging us into an abyss where only the hunter's cruel smile remained visible, a beacon of impending doom that promised the nightmare was far from over, and my torment was only beginning. The darkness swallowed us whole, a choking void that erased all boundaries between predator and prey, between the rusted, broken carcass of the amusement park and the fragile, trembling body I inhabited, and in that blackened maw, his smile was the only thing that burned with cruel clarity. A grotesque beacon of merciless intent that illuminated the cold sweat slicking down my back and the shallow, ragged breaths I struggled to keep silent in the oppressive stillness, because any sound, any flicker of life, was an invitation to the hunter who moved with the patient inevitability of a nightmare creeping beneath the skin. Each step he took was measured, deliberate, an echoing drumbeat of malice that pounded against the fragile walls of my sanity and pressed me tighter against the cracked concrete, the rough texture biting into my skin through the soaked fabric of the bare suit, as if the very park itself conspired with him, the silence around us thick, alive, and watchful, waiting for the moment when the final act would unfold and the dance of terror would end in blood. I could feel the scent of him. A rancid mixture of sweat, rust, and decay, tainting the stale air and making my stomach churn with a nauseating certainty that this was no random attack but a ritual long rehearsed, a hunting game that had been played and replayed in the shadows for years, with me as the newest and most desperate participant in a cruel pantomime that blurred the line between reality and nightmare until they were indistinguishable. My mind raced, searching for any flicker of hope, any crack in the relentless facade of his menace, but all I found was the raw, gnawing terror that clawed at my throat and squeezed my lungs tight until I was gasping, a frantic animal caught in a trap too cruelly designed to escape. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to vanish into the endless maze of broken rides and shattered memories, but the hunter's presence was a weight that crushed any such foolish hope. A gravity pulling me inexorably toward the heart of the park's darkest secret. Then, in a voice low and venomous, he spoke again, words dripping with bitter satisfaction. "You thought you could outlast me. You thought the darkness would protect you. But the truth is, you were mine the moment you stepped inside these gates. The park chose you, and now, so do I." The finality of his declaration was a hammer blow to my resolve, shattering what fragile hope I'd clung to and replacing it with a cold, numb acceptance of the nightmare that had become my reality. I was trapped, caught in the hunter's grip, a prisoner of the park's twisted heart, and the only thing left to do was to survive long enough to see what horrors lay beyond the final door. As the distance between us closed, the suffocating darkness seemed to pulse in time with my ragged heartbeat, each thump a drumroll for the impending crescendo of terror, and I knew, with a clarity as sharp and unforgiving as a knife's edge, that whatever awaited me in the shadows ahead would change everything, or end me utterly. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, a suffocating tunnel of rust and rot that seemed to close in around me with each agonizing step, the very walls pulsating with a slow, sinister heartbeat that echoed through the stale air like the drumbeat of impending doom, and as I moved forward, the weight of the bare suit felt heavier, a tangible shroud of despair and inevitability settling on my shoulders that threatened to crush the fragile remnants of my sanity beneath its relentless pressure. Each footfall was a muted thud swallowed by the oppressive silence, a desperate rhythm that marked the slow, grinding march toward a fate I could neither see nor understand, but could feel coiling around me like a serpent tightening its grip, cold, merciless, and absolute in its determination to drag me into the abyss. The hunter's presence was a shadow at my back, a cold breath against the nape of my neck, unseen but palpable, a relentless force that drove me onward with cruel purpose, as if the very air had been poisoned with the scent of fear and despair, and every breath I drew was a stolen gift, ragged and shallow, punctuated by the steady, merciless thrum of my heart hammering against my ribs like a frantic prisoner desperate to escape its cage. Ahead, the faint glow of a cracked neon sign flickered erratically, casting fractured shards of sickly light onto the peeling walls, illuminating the graffiti-scrawled warnings and long-forgotten pleas etched into the decaying plaster, words half erased by time but still screaming with desperate clarity, like the last echoes of souls consumed by the park's insatiable hunger. The threshold loomed before me, a heavy steel door corroded by years of neglect, its surface scarred and dented, the faded letters barely legible, service entrance, authorized personnel only. Beyond it, I sensed the heart of the nightmare, a dark sanctuary where the twisted rituals and unspeakable horrors of the park were born and nurtured in shadow. My trembling hand reached out, fingers brushing against the cold metal, and the surface felt alive beneath my touch, pulsing faintly as if the door itself breathed with a malevolent life, a barrier between the fragile hope I clung to and the abyss that waited patiently beyond. The hunter's voice whispered in my ear, a silk-coated threat that sent a fresh wave of icy dread crashing through my veins. Beyond this door lies the truth you've been running from. Step inside, and there's no turning back. The darkness will claim you, just as it has claimed all the others. A surge of primal fear exploded in my chest, a wildfire of panic and desperation that begged me to flee, to tear away from this place and never look back, but the walls seemed to close tighter, the shadows pressing in like the hands of 1,000 unseen captors, and I knew with sickening certainty that there was no escape. Only the slow, inevitable unraveling that awaited beyond the threshold. Summoning every ounce of willpower, I pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning a mournful dirge as the air beyond spilled forth, thick with the scent of mold, rot, and something far fouler, a stench that clawed at my throat and turned my stomach with its vile intensity. Inside, the room was a cavern of darkness, punctuated only by the faint, flickering light of a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, its weak glow casting grotesque shadows that writhed and twisted like living things across the cracked tiles and shattered machinery, revealing glimpses of twisted metal frameworks, shattered glass, and forgotten relics of a happiness long since devoured by time and cruelty. And there, in the center of the room, stood the altar of the nightmare. An ancient, scarred platform stained with dark, unidentifiable marks, surrounded by remnants of faded banners and broken toys, a shrine to the monstrous ritual that had bound me to this place and marked the final act of a horror beyond comprehension. As the hunter stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with cruel triumph, I realized that this was the true heart of the park's darkness. The source of its endless hunger, its unquenchable thirst for fear and suffering, and the place where my own fate would be sealed in blood and shadow. The door slammed shut behind me, the echo ringing like a death knell, and the last flicker of light died, plunging us into a darkness so complete it seemed to consume all hope, all reason, leaving only the cold, crushing certainty that the nightmare was finally ready to claim me as its own. The darkness enveloped me completely, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed in on every side, a void so absolute it erased all sense of space and time, and yet within that consuming blackness, my senses were painfully heightened. The faint, metallic tang of blood lingering in the stale air, the distant drip of water echoing like a taunt from some unseen corner, and the heavy, rhythmic sound of my own heartbeat pounding against my ribs like a desperate drum, screaming a frantic warning I could no longer ignore. The hunter's footsteps were slow, deliberate, each step a measured percussion that fractured the silence with the sound of inevitable doom, and as he approached, the dim glow of a cracked lantern flickered into life, casting long, grotesque shadows that stretched across the scarred floor like the twisted limbs of some ancient, malevolent beast. His face emerged from the gloom. A cruel mask of satisfaction painted over years of bitterness and rage, eyes gleaming with a savage intelligence that chilled me to the core. Before me, the altar stood as a grotesque monument to the park's darkest secrets. A slab of cracked concrete, stained deep with the remnants of countless forgotten horrors, its surface marred by scratches and strange symbols etched in a language that felt older than time itself, and scattered around its base were remnants of broken dolls, rusted tools, and scraps of fabric, all silent witnesses to the unspeakable acts that had taken place here. His voice cut through the thick air, low and venomous, weaving a story of torment and obsession that hung heavy between us like the scent of decay. This park was never about fun, he whispered, each word laced with bitter venom. It was a trap, a cage for lost souls like you, drawn here by the promise of escape, only to be swallowed by the darkness that feeds on hope and fear alike. My throat tightened as he circled the altar, the lantern's flickering light revealing the raw edges of scars on his arms, crude tattoos that told stories of pain and madness, and the cold glint of a knife that caught the light with a sinister gleam. Every detail was etched into my mind, the slow, deliberate way he prepared the space, the ritualistic care with which he arranged the broken remnants, as if feeding some ancient hunger with the shards of forgotten dreams. Fear twisted into something darker, an icy resolve born from the primal need to survive, and I knew the nightmare was far from over. I had to fight, to claw my way back from the brink of oblivion, even if it meant confronting the monstrous humanity that lurked behind the hunter's mask, and the horrifying truth that this place was not just a prison, but a living, breathing nightmare that thrived on the destruction of those who dared to enter. As the hunter raised the knife, the lantern flickered violently, casting wild, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own, and in that moment, the line between reality and nightmare blurred irrevocably, and I realized with bone-deep certainty that whatever awaited me next would shatter every last fragment of hope and thrust me into a darkness from which there was no return. The knife gleamed under the flickering lantern light, a cruel shard of silver that seemed to pulse with malevolence, every inch a weapon forged in the fires of pain and madness, and as the hunter's grip tightened around its handle, I felt the oppressive weight of inevitability crush down on me like a leaden shroud, smothering any last flicker of hope in a suffocating embrace of dread. My mind raced desperately, claws scraping at the walls of sanity as the room itself seemed to close in, the cracked concrete altar before me transforming into a grotesque stage where the final act of horror would unfold in slow, torturous detail. The air thickened with the stench of rot and rust, a choking miasma that clung to my skin like a second, malignant flesh, and the shadows grew deeper, swelling and writhing as if alive, hungry to consume the fragile flicker of life that remained in my battered body. The hunter's eyes, cold and merciless, locked onto mine, and in their depths I saw a reflection not just of the man he was but of the monstrous entity the park had forged from the shattered remains of countless souls, a twisted king reigning over a kingdom of decay and despair, and the cruel smile that tugged at his lips was a promise, a vow etched in blood and madness that my fate was sealed, and the darkness would claim me as its own. I tried to move, to summon some desperate burst of strength, but my limbs felt leaden, weighed down by fear and exhaustion, and every breath was a ragged gasp swallowed by the oppressive silence that stretched between us like a noose tightening with deliberate cruelty. The lantern flickered once more, casting a wild, stuttering glow that revealed glimpses of the twisted relics littering the floor, fragments of broken toys, shards of shattered glass, scraps of faded fabric. All silent witnesses to the horrors that had played out in this accursed room, and to the new nightmare about to be born. His voice broke the silence, low and dripping with dark satisfaction. You thought you could escape the darkness, but it's already inside you, waiting to break free. This place, this park, it's a mirror reflecting the worst parts of us all, and tonight, you'll become a part of its story. The word slithered through the air, sinking deep into my skin, igniting a raw, primal terror that twisted my gut into knots of cold fire, and with every heartbeat, the shadows seemed to pulse and throb in time, a sinister rhythm that echoed the relentless drumbeat of my own fading hope. Then, with a sudden, brutal motion, he lunged forward, the knife slicing through the stale air toward me, and in that fractured instant, time slowed. The world reduced to the harsh, metallic scent of blood, the jagged scrape of fabric tearing, and the cruel, unyielding truth that this nightmare was no longer a story but a living, breathing reality, and the darkness was hungry for my soul. Pain exploded like wildfire across my skin, a searing brand that tore through every instinct to survive and turned my world into a maelstrom of agony and fear, but even as the knife's cruel kiss sliced through flesh and muscle, my mind screamed for clarity, for any fragment of strength to fight back against the darkness that sought to drown me in its endless void. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, mixing with the stale rot of the decaying amusement park, and every breath I drew was a ragged gasp, a desperate plea against the suffocating grip of death that tightened with merciless precision. The hunter loomed over me, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of triumph and madness, eyes burning with a fire that seemed less human and more the reflection of the abyss itself, and as he raised the knife again, ready to finish what he had begun, the shadows around us pulsed like a living thing, swelling and curling like smoke, ready to consume the last flicker of light that remained within me. But beneath the crushing weight of pain and despair, something fierce and raw ignited. A primal will to survive that clawed its way through the haze of agony and fear, and with a sudden, desperate surge, I twisted free from the hunter's grasp, the sharp edge of the blade grazing my skin but failing to claim me fully, and I stumbled backward, crashing against the cold, unforgiving wall of the ruined room, breath ragged and burning with the effort of defiance. The hunter snarled, a low, guttural sound that echoed with rage and frustration, and lunged again, but this time I was ready, my mind razor-sharp with the clarity born of desperation, every movement fueled by the raw terror and determination that only the brink of oblivion can forge, and I dodged, weaving through the shadows that danced like phantoms in the flickering lantern light, searching for any weakness in the relentless storm of madness that pursued me. Around us, the room seemed to pulse and shift, the twisted relics of the park's dark past glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, the symbols etched into the altar throbbing like the heart of some ancient beast awakening from a long slumber, and I knew that this was more than a simple fight for survival, it was a battle for my very soul against the monstrous legacy of the park itself. With trembling hands, I grabbed a rusted piece of broken metal from the floor, its jagged edge a poor weapon but the only hope I had, and as the hunter charged once more, I swung with every ounce of strength left in my battered body, the clash of metal against flesh ringing through the suffocating air like a desperate cry of defiance against the encroaching darkness. The struggle was a brutal dance of pain and fury, every moment stretched to the breaking point, every breath a fragile thread hanging on the edge of oblivion, and as the lantern flickered and threatened to die, casting us into complete darkness, I realized with a chilling clarity that whatever the outcome, this night would mark the end of everything I had been and the beginning of a nightmare that would never truly end. The silence that followed the clash was suffocating, thick and heavy like a shroud wrapping itself tightly around what was left of my battered body and shattered mind. The dim lantern flickered, its faint glow trembling in the overwhelming blackness, casting grotesque shadows that slithered along the cracked walls like predators waiting patiently for their prey's last breath. Every muscle in me screamed for relief, but I could only lie there, drenched in sweat and blood, the taste of iron thick on my tongue, my ragged breath rasping through broken lips as the cold began to seep into my bones, whispering promises of oblivion. Somewhere deep inside, a part of me still clung to the fragile thread of hope that I could escape this nightmare, but the truth was unmistakable and brutal. The hunter was no mere man, but a living embodiment of the park's relentless decay and cruelty, a monstrous force born from years of neglect, broken promises, and souls twisted by desperation and madness. His victory wasn't just in the blood staining the floor but in the way the darkness now held me captive, folding around me like a cloak, sealing my fate in the cold embrace of this forgotten graveyard of dreams. I tried to push myself up, but the pain was an unrelenting wall, each movement a jagged knife stabbing into my side, and through the haze of agony and fading consciousness, I saw him standing over me, his face a mask of something that wasn't quite human, something ancient and unforgiving. The knife glinted once more, but this time there was no rush, no frantic lunge, only the slow, deliberate dragging of its edge along my skin, a cruel caress that promised a final release or an eternal torment. "Look around you," he whispered, voice low and dangerous. "This park is a tomb, and you're just the latest corpse waiting to be claimed. No one leaves here." "Not really." His words hung in the air, a chilling epitaph carved into the silence, as the shadows seemed to pulse and close in, swallowing the flicker of light and hope in one cruel breath. I closed my eyes, the world tipping into a void where memory and nightmare bled indistinguishably into one another. The laughter of children long gone, the creak of rusted rides in the wind, the twisted, broken promises etched into every shattered window and cracked tile. And in that endless darkness, I realized the terrible truth: this place wasn't just abandoned, it was alive, and it fed on the broken, the lost, and the damned. The last thing I felt was the cold edge of the blade tracing a final line across my skin, and then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time became meaningless in the dark, but when I awoke, the silence was absolute, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves and the distant cry of a lone crow. The park lay quiet, empty except for the ghosts that still whispered in the wind. I was alone, broken, and forever changed, a living testament to the horrors that lurked beneath the faded colors and forgotten laughter. The sun rose slowly, its pale light struggling to reach the depths of the park's shadowed heart, but it was too late for me. The darkness had already claimed what it needed. And somewhere, in the silence, the hunter's shadow moved again, waiting patiently for the next soul foolish enough to wander into the forgotten nightmare. The weeks after that night stretched out in a haze of disjointed memories and fractured nightmares, each one unraveling the thin thread of my sanity further, until I was left with nothing but the raw, aching truth of what I had endured and the grim realization that some horrors refused to stay buried. The park, with its peeling paint and rusted rides, its empty laughter and shadows that seemed to breathe, was never just a place. It was a living wound, a festering scar on the landscape of forgotten souls, and I had become a part of its dark history, trapped between the realms of the living and the dead. Friends and strangers alike asked me what happened, their eyes wide with disbelief and fear as I recounted fragments of my ordeal, the hunter who was no monster in the supernatural sense, but something far more terrifying. A man shaped by years of bitterness, loss, and cruelty, whose hatred had twisted him into the park's dark heart, feeding the place with blood and broken spirits. I told them about the ritual, the altar, the shadows that moved with malevolent purpose, and how the park itself seemed to hunger, alive in ways that defied reason and sanity. Yet no one could truly understand, not until they heard the whispered stories of vanished visitors, the warnings etched into faded signs, and the local rumors of a place where hope goes to die and darkness waits to claim the souls of the curious and the desperate alike. The amusement park was more than abandoned. It was cursed, a trap that preyed on the fractured and the lost, its history stained with the echoes of forgotten screams and the slow decay of human cruelty masked beneath the guise of fun. I often returned there in my nightmares, walking once more among the twisted remnants of laughter and despair, feeling the cold breath of the hunter's presence close behind me, his eyes watching, waiting for the moment to strike again. I have tried to leave the past behind, but the park has left its mark on me, an indelible stain on my soul that no amount of daylight can wash away. So, if you ever find yourself drawn to the promise of forgotten places, beware the shadows that cling to them and the silence that screams beneath their surface. Some places do not want to be found. Some darkness does not want to be disturbed. And if you hear the slow, deliberate footsteps in the night, or see the flicker of a lantern's dying light dancing just beyond the edge of vision, do not follow. Do not seek answers in the black void. Because once you step inside, once the darkness has tasted your fear, there may be no escape. The amusement park waits, patient and hungry, and the hunter still prowls its broken pathways, ready to claim the next soul foolish enough to wander into the nightmare. Heed this warning well. Some doors are better left closed.